Months later, Sandra stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking the ocean, a place Caleb had told her he loved. She scattered his ashes into the wind, whispering a silent goodbye. In that moment, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The men who had shaped her life were no longer weights dragging her down. They were part of her story, yes, but no longer the whole of it. Sandra turned away from the cliff, the horizon stretching out before her. It was time to move forward, not defined by her past, but guided by the lessons it had taught her. In the weeks that followed, Sandra made changes. She began therapy, not just to process the betrayal, but to rediscover who she was beyond being a wife or a lover. She reconnected with Mira, spent time in nature, and even started writing, a passion she had long ignored. When she visited Caleb again, it was to say goodbye. His condition had worsened, but his spirit remained strong. "I'm proud of you," he said weakly, "for finding yourself." Sandra smiled through her tears. "I'm still figuring it out, but I think I'll get there." Daniel, too, became part of her healing journey, not as a husband, but as a man seeking redemption. They met occasionally for coffee, their conversations cautious but honest. Sandra didn't know if she could forgive him fully, but she could see his efforts to change. Days later, Sandra received a letter from Caleb. His handwriting was shaky, but the words carried a clarity he had struggled to express in person. "Sandra, I want you to know that I never stopped thinking of you. Loving you and Daniel taught me more about myself than I ever thought possible. But I've also learned that love, real love, isn't about possession or perfection. It's about honesty, even when it's painful. I hope you find that, whether it's with Daniel or someone else, or even just with yourself." The letter brought Sandra to tears. Caleb was right. For years, she had defined herself by the love she gave others. Maybe it was time to redefine herself by the love she gave to herself. Sandra met Daniel that evening at the park, where the autumn leaves swirled around them in golden waves. He looked worn, as if the weeks apart had aged him. She noticed the faint hope in his eyes, a hope she wasn't sure she could fulfill. "Why did you choose me?" Sandra asked, her voice steady but laced with pain. "If you couldn't be honest with yourself, why marry me at all?" Daniel sighed. "Because I wanted to be the man you saw in me. I thought that if I loved you enough, it would erase the part of me I was too scared to face. But I see now that wasn't fair, to you or to me." Sandra nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "I gave you everything, Daniel, and now I don't know if I have anything left to give." His face crumpled, but he didn't argue. Instead, he said, "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Sandra. I just want you to know that loving you wasn't a lie. It was the truest thing I've ever done." Her heart ached at his words, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing beneath the rustling trees. The next morning, Sandra drove to Caleb's office in Seattle. The sight of him after so many years stirred a mix of emotions: grief for what they had lost, warmth for the familiarity of his smile, and anger for the secrets he had kept. "I didn't know if you'd come," Caleb admitted as they sat across from each other. His frailty was evident, his once vibrant energy dimmed by illness. Sandra didn't waste time. "Why didn't you tell me? About Daniel? About everything?" Caleb sighed. "I was ashamed, Sandra, ashamed of leaving you, ashamed of hurting him. I thought I was doing the right thing by disappearing, but all I did was leave more damage behind." As they talked, Sandra began to see Caleb not as the man who had abandoned her, but as someone deeply flawed and afraid, much like Daniel. His fear of rejection had led him to run, just as Daniel's fear had led him to hide. Their choices had shaped her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. When Caleb reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. "I'm sorry for the pain I caused you," he said, his voice trembling, "and I hope you can find the peace I never could." Sandra sat by her window, the photo of Caleb and Daniel resting on the table beside her. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within. Two men she had loved, two betrayals intertwined, and a decision looming over her. She felt paralyzed, torn between anger and the fragile strands of love that still bound her to both of them. The words Caleb had spoken, "I never stopped loving either of you," echoed in her mind. Did she have the strength to face them again, to reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal? And yet a part of her longed for closure, to understand whether forgiveness was possible, for them or for herself. That evening, she composed 2 letters. The first to Caleb was short and hesitant. I need to see you. I don't know if I can forgive, but I need to understand. The second to Daniel was raw and unfiltered. I'll never forget what you did, but I'm trying to decide if I can move forward. Meet me tomorrow. When Sandra sent the messages, she felt a strange relief. For the first time in weeks, the weight of indecision lifted. What lay ahead was uncertain, but at least she had taken a step. As Daniel left, Sandra sat alone, grappling with the depth of the betrayal. But something about Caleb's story nagged at her. Why had he called her now? What was his real reason? Later that night, another call came from Caleb. Sandra, there's something else you need to know, he said, his voice heavy with regret. I've been sick, terminally, and I didn't want to leave this world without making things right with you and with Daniel. Sandra's breath caught. Why now? She asked. Caleb hesitated before replying. Because I never stopped loving either of you. I just didn't know how to live with that truth. The revelation hit Sandra like a tidal wave. Caleb's love hadn't disappeared. It had been fractured, complicated, tied up in a web of fear and shame that spanned decades. She realized then that she wasn't just mourning her marriage or her past with Caleb. She was mourning the lives they could have lived if fear hadn't stood in the way. That evening, Sandra sat in her living room, staring at the photograph again. The connections between Caleb and Daniel felt like threads tightening around her. She couldn't avoid the confrontation any longer. She called Daniel, her voice steady but cold. We need to talk. They met at a park bench under the fading light of dusk. Daniel looked gaunt, as if the guilt had been eating away at him. What's this about? He asked. Sandra handed him the photo. Explain this, she demanded. Daniel's face paled. Where did you find this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. When Sandra didn't respond, he buried his head in his hands. I should have told you, he said, but I was ashamed of who I was, of what I did to you to Caleb. His confession spilled out in fragments, how he had loved Caleb but couldn't reconcile it with the life he thought he was supposed to live, how he buried that love deep, convincing himself that marrying Sandra would make it all go away. You weren't a lie, Daniel said, tears streaming down his face. I loved you, I still do, but I've been lying to myself for so long, I don't even know who I am anymore. Sandra's anger flared. You stole him from me, she said, her voice shaking, and now you've taken 16 years of my life too. How do I forgive that? 2 days later, Sandra's phone rang. The caller ID read unknown, but she knew. Sandra, Caleb's voice was warm, but there was a nervous edge to it. It's been a long time, she exhaled sharply. It has. I never thought I'd hear from you again. Caleb's chuckle was soft. Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? But Sandra wasn't here for small talk. I found something, Caleb, a photo of you and my husband. The line went silent. When Caleb finally spoke, his voice was heavy. Sandra, I owe you an explanation. He told her everything. He and Daniel had met in their 20s during a summer abroad in Paris. What started as a whirlwind romance became something deeper, something transformative. But Daniel's fear of rejection, of his family, his future, drove them apart. Caleb had tried to stay, but Daniel had chosen to bury that part of himself. Sandra's grip on the phone tightened. You left because of him? She asked, her voice cracking. Caleb sighed. Yes. I thought leaving would be easier than staying and watching him deny who he was. But I didn't know he'd marry you, Sandra. I didn't know. The weight of his words pressed down on her. Daniel hadn't just betrayed her with Elliot. His betrayal stretched back decades, tying him to the man she had once loved. Sandra couldn't take her eyes off the photograph. The caption, "To my Daniel always," spun in her mind like a storm. Caleb had been hers, her first great love. How could he have been Daniel's too? Questions bubbled up, each more unsettling than the last. Had they known each other? Had Caleb's abrupt disappearance all those years ago been tied to Daniel? She needed answers, but the idea of confronting Daniel felt overwhelming. Every time she thought about dialing his number, her chest tightened. Instead, Sandra decided to start where it all began, with Caleb. She spent hours online, searching for any trace of him. Finally, she found something, a modest website for a nonprofit he had founded in Seattle. His photo smiled back at her, older but unmistakable. Sandra's heart raced as she clicked Contact Us. A generic email form popped up, but it felt too impersonal. Instead, she called the listed number, her fingers trembling as she pressed each digit. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "Caleb Edwards' office," a woman said. Sandra hesitated before replying, I need to speak with him. It's personal." The woman paused, then asked, "May I have your name?" Sandra gave it, unsure if Caleb would even remember her. The phone call came late at night, jarring Sandra from her restless sleep. It was an unknown number. "Hello?" she answered groggily, expecting a telemarketer, but the voice on the other end froze her. "Sandra, it's about Caleb." She hadn't heard that name in over 20 years. Caleb, her first love, the man she had almost married before Daniel. Hearing it now felt like someone had unearthed a ghost. "What, what's this about?" she stammered. The voice hesitated before saying, "There are things you need to know about him, things that might change the way you see all of this." The line went dead before she could ask anything more. Shaken, Sandra tried to push the call from her mind, but memories of Caleb surfaced with startling clarity. She remembered the way he made her laugh, the warmth of his hands, and the way he had left without warning one summer evening. She had never gotten closure, never learned the truth of why he disappeared. Sandra's curiosity grew over the next few days, intersecting with her pain. Could the betrayal she felt now be connected to the one she'd experienced then? Was this a pattern or just a cruel coincidence? Desperate for answers, Sandra searched through an old box of letters tucked away in her attic. In it, she found a photograph of Caleb, smiling, carefree. But what caught her attention was the handwriting on the back, "To my Daniel, always." Her breath caught. Daniel? The man she married? How could they possibly be connected? The photograph felt like a key to a door she wasn't sure she wanted to open. While Sandra unraveled at home, Daniel was waging his own war. Sitting alone in his rented apartment, he stared at the empty walls. He had always envisioned freedom as something bright and liberating, but this didn't feel like freedom. It felt like exile. Daniel had known he was different long before Sandra entered his life. Growing up in a conservative family, he had learned to suppress those feelings. The shame, the fear, they had become second nature. When he met Sandra, she had been a beacon of hope. Her warmth and acceptance made him believe he could rewrite himself, erase the parts of him he didn't understand, but pretending hadn't erased anything. Over time, the cracks began to show. Every anniversary gift, every kiss goodnight, they all came with an undercurrent of guilt. He loved Sandra, but it wasn't the love she deserved. Elliot was different. With him, Daniel could breathe. But that freedom came with a cost, one Daniel hadn't fully grasped until the moment Sandra looked him in the eye and asked, "Who is Elliot?" Her voice haunted him, breaking through the walls of denial he had spent years constructing. He picked up his phone to text Sandra again. But what could he say? He had already confessed the affair. How could he explain that the man she married had never truly existed, that he didn't even know himself? His therapist's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself. But the thought of losing Sandra, her wit, her strength, the way she made the world feel less lonely, was a pain he hadn't anticipated. The days after the cafe meeting blurred into a haze of questions and self-doubt. Sandra paced her empty house, every corner reminding her of the life she thought she had. The laughter that once echoed in their kitchen felt like a cruel mockery. Each photograph on the wall, a vacation in Greece, their anniversary dinner, was now a silent witness to a fractured love. "Was I enough?" she whispered to the darkness one night. The silence didn't answer, but her own insecurities screamed back. She replayed moments where she might have failed. The nights she stayed late at work, the arguments over petty things, the times she felt more like his roommate than his wife. But as the days passed, anger began to replace the self-blame. She realized that Daniel's betrayal wasn't about her. His infidelity and the lies were choices he made. Yet that understanding didn't soothe the ache. If she wasn't the problem, why hadn't she been enough to be his truth? One afternoon, Sandra sought comfort in an old friend, Mira. Over wine and years of trust, she confessed everything. "I feel like a fool," Sandra said, tears streaming. 16 years, Mira. 16 years, and I didn't see it." Mira's response surprised her. "Sandra, you're not a fool. You trusted him. That's what love is supposed to be." But Sandra wasn't convinced. Trust felt like a fragile thing now, something broken so completely it couldn't be pieced back together. Mira hesitated before adding, "What if this is about more than the affair? Maybe this is about you figuring out who you are without him." The words lingered. Who was Sandra now? A betrayed wife or something more? Sandra retreated to her childhood home after the confrontation, seeking solace in familiarity. Her mother's kitchen smelled of lavender and honey, a sharp contrast to the chaos in her heart. Over tea, Sandra tried to make sense of it all. "Do you think he ever loved me?" she asked, her voice cracking. Her mother sighed, her eyes heavy with wisdom. "Love is complicated. Sometimes people love us the best way they can, even if it's not the way we need." But Sandra wasn't sure if love could survive the kind of betrayal she had uncovered. At night, Sandra scoured her memories for signs she had missed. Daniel's distant gazes during dinner, the unexplained absences. They were there, now glaringly obvious. But what hurt most wasn't the affair itself, it was the lie of their life together. Meanwhile, Daniel sent messages, pleading for a chance to explain. She ignored most of them until one line caught her attention. "It's not just about me, Sandra, it's about us." She hesitated. What could us mean now? Determined to find answers, Sandra agreed to meet Daniel at a neutral spot. The cafe where they'd had their first date felt cruelly ironic, but it was familiar territory. When she arrived, Daniel was already there, a shadow of the confident man she once knew. His vulnerability startled her, but she didn't let it soften her resolve. "Why, Daniel?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. He looked up, his face lined with regret. "Because I couldn't be honest with myself. And if I couldn't be honest with me, how could I be honest with you?" His words hit her like a wave. This wasn't just about cheating, it was about identity, about a truth buried so deeply it had suffocated them both. For the first time, Sandra saw Daniel not as her betrayer, but as a man at war with himself. The words flashed across the screen like a thunderbolt. "Meet me at the cafe. We need to talk." Sandra stared at her husband's phone, her heart pounding. Her hand trembled as she scrolled through the messages, each one dripping with intimacy that didn't belong in her marriage. At first, she thought it was a woman, a young, vivacious figure she could resent, but the name was unmistakably male, Elliot. Sandra sank into the couch, her mind spinning. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a revelation. Had she missed the signs? She thought of her husband, Daniel, their 16 years together and the life they built, a quiet home filled with small joys and routines. This wasn't just another affair. It was a world-shattering shift in identity, theirs and his. The room felt suffocating. Daniel would be home soon, and she didn't know if she could face him. Sandra's eyes darted around, landing on their wedding photo. She remembered that day vividly, the way he looked at her with promises she thought would never be broken. What was real, and what had been a lie? When the door opened, Sandra stiffened. Daniel's cheerful, "Hey, love," sliced through the tension like a blade. She couldn't hold back. "Who is Elliot?" she asked, her voice a trembling whisper. His smile faltered, and in that moment, Sandra's world tilted. Daniel didn't deny it. Instead, he collapsed onto the chair, burying his face in his hands. "I didn't want you to find out like this," he murmured. His voice cracked, but Sandra felt no sympathy. Her chest burned with betrayal, anger, and a hollow ache she couldn't yet name. As the truth spilled out, late-night meetings, a double life she never suspected, Sandra felt herself unraveling. The man she had loved was a stranger, and she couldn't help but wonder, had she ever truly known him?